Welcome to the debate. When you look through a high-powered telescope and see a brilliantly structured, distant galaxy, you don't immediately assume that the galaxy is just a hallucination, just because you can flawlessly describe the engineering of the telescope.
Right. You know how it's built. Sure.
Exactly. You know exactly how the glass lenses bend the light, you know how the casing holds the mirrors, but that mechanism of observation doesn't negate the reality of the massive object being observed.
Well, okay, but there's a vital caveat to that. If you look through that exact same telescope and you see a speck of dust that is actually sitting right there on the glass lens itself.
Ah, I see where you're going.
Right. It would be a profound mistake to document that speck of dust as a newly discovered planet.
And that brings us to the core of what we are unpacking today. Because when the human mind experiences a profound transcendent connection to God, is it using a perfectly engineered biological instrument to perceive an objective divine reality? Or, as you would argue, are we just looking at a speck of evolutionary dust on our own neural lenses?
Exactly. We are looking at the central question of human existence. Can rational logic and spiritual experience genuinely coexist as valid pathways to truth, or is everything we call religion and God merely a neurocognitive evolutionary byproduct?
Which is a massive question.
It is. And I look at the recent neurocognitive research on the biology of belief, and my position is that the concept of God is fully explainable through evolutionary biology, brain mechanics, and sociocultural construction, making supernatural explanations entirely unnecessary.
And I look at that exact same data and see the complete opposite conclusion. I will be defending the position that our neurocognitive architecture and our capacity for rational logic are perfectly tuned instruments designed by a creator to apprehend an objective, transcendent, divine reality.
So the fact that we are wired for belief is a feature, not a bug.
Precisely. It is functioning at its absolute highest capacity.
Well, let's start right there with the wiring, because the wiring is where your telescope analogy completely falls apart for me. We don't need to guess about what's happening in the brain during a religious experience anymore.
Because of the imaging.
Right. We can put a person in an fMRI machine and literally watch it happen. And what we see isn't the brain connecting to the cosmos. We see the brain naturally compartmentalizing to manage stress and create a comforting narrative.
Hold on. I wouldn't call it compartmentalizing to manage stress. If you look at the recent neurocognitive integrative models, they show a brilliant, purposeful division of labor in the brain.
How so?
Well, you have the ventromedial prefrontal cortex, the VMFPC, which handles emotional valuation and personal meaning. Then you have the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, the DLPFC, which manages logic, executive function, and critical thinking.
Sure, the standard executive network.
Right. And during deep prayer or a profound spiritual experience, the brain doesn't just shut off the logical DLPFC to let the emotional VMFPC run wild.
It doesn't shut it off completely, no, but it certainly turns down the volume.
It modulates it, yes. Think of it like a commercial airliner. The DLPFC is the pilot, handling the mechanics and the strict logic of the flight. The VMFPC is the navigation system, finding the meaning and the destination.
Okay, I follow the analogy.
So during spiritual states, the brain shifts gears so the navigation system can take in the broader experiential reality. But the pilot never actually leaves the seat. It's a synthesis of logical analysis with spiritual truth.
But that synthesis...
Let me just finish the thought. If belief is really just a primitive evolutionary error, why does it integrate so flawlessly with our highest order executive functions, even in individuals with very high cognitive flexibility?
Because that integration was so biologically selected for. It kept our ancestors alive. You're looking at this complex neural dance and calling it a divine tuning fork. But let's look at the mechanism itself.
Okay, let's look at it.
Let's talk about HAD, hyperactive agency detection. This is a very well-documented survival tool. Imagine our early human ancestors walking through the savannah. They hear the grass rustle.
The classic predator-prey scenario.
Exactly. If they assumed it's just the wind, but it's actually a lion, they die. They get eliminated from the gene pool. If they mistakenly attribute intention to the grass, assuming a predator is there when it's really just the wind, they run away and survive.
So you're saying we are biologically predisposed to false positives.
100%. We are evolutionarily primed to see agents, intentions, and minds behind things, even when there are absolutely none. Your cognitive God is just the ultimate false positive. It's a primitive misattribution on a cosmic scale.
That is quite the leap, though.
But add to that our genetic predispositions. Look at the VMAT2 gene, for instance.
Ah, the so-called God gene.
Right, though I admit that term is a bit sensationalized. But think of VMAT2 like a biological dial for how your brain processes neurotransmitters like dopamine and serotonin.
Sure.
If you tweak that gene, a person's capacity for feeling profound spiritual awe literally goes up or down. What feels to you like a life-altering encounter with the divine is essentially an internal neurochemical event regulated by a genetic dial. It's an internal coping mechanism to deal with the sheer terror of existence.
Look, I see the data you're pulling from, but your conclusion makes a massive philosophical leap. You are assuming that survival utility and objective truth are somehow mutually exclusive.
They aren't mutually exclusive, but survival doesn't require objective truth. It just requires utility.
But it is entirely plausible and logically sound that a purposeful creator would design an organism whose survival is directly enhanced by apprehending the truth of its environment. And that includes the spiritual environment.
But there is no external spiritual environment to apprehend. It's all happening inside the skull.
Wait, let's look at how biology handles other truths. I mean, we get incredible dopamine hits from eating a good meal, right? Or forming romantic attachments.
Yes, because they promote survival.
Exactly. Our biology heavily rewards us for those things. But the biological reward system doesn't mean food is an illusion. It doesn't mean other human beings are just internal coping mechanisms.
Well, no, of course not.
Right. The reward system simply ensures we pursue what is fundamentally good, real, and necessary for us. If God is real, it makes perfect sense that we would be wired with a biological dial to tune into that reality.
The difference, though, is that I can measure the nutritional content of the food you eat. I can independently verify the existence of your romantic partner. Food and humans can be tested and observed outside the confines of your brain.
And God cannot be put in a test tube, yes.
God cannot be observed objectively. All you have are subjective feelings reinforced by oxytocin to promote social bonding. Anthropologists like Pascal Boyer and Scott Atran have pointed out these are just frameworks to keep tribes cooperating. If we can't test it externally, it remains a speck of dust on the lens.
Okay, well, let's step outside the skull then. Let's look at external realities that we both agree exist, but that naturalism really struggles to explain.
I'm intrigued. What external realities?
Let's shift the focus to moral obligations. If everything is just a neurochemical ledger for survival, how do you explain the universal haunting of objective morality?
Haunting. That's quite the phrase. What exactly do you mean by that?
It's an idea C.S. Lewis explored beautifully. He pointed out that human beings all over the globe, across entirely different cultures and epochs, are universally haunted by the idea of a sort of behavior they ought to practice: fair play, decency, justice.
Right.
And yet we consistently fail to meet that standard. If morality is merely an adaptation for species survival, like say an opposable thumb or a fear of snakes, then moral duties are just an ever-changing biological illusion.
They aren't an illusion, they are the rules of the game for a highly social species. Evolutionary sociobiology explains this perfectly through reciprocal altruism.
The idea of I scratch your back, you scratch mine?
Exactly. If I share meat with you today, you share with me tomorrow. It's a ledger of survival.
But a ledger doesn't explain the profound weight of moral duty. If morality is just an evolutionary survival strategy, then murder isn't objectively wrong. It's just socially disadvantageous at this current stage of primate evolution.
It threatens the stability of the group.
But if another species evolved to survive by eating their weak, that would be moral for them. Without a maximally good, necessary being as a transcendent stopping point to ground these values, we have no actual duty to be good. We just have a chemical urge urging us to cooperate. The fact that we feel real guilt, the fact that we recognize profound evil, points to an objective moral lawgiver.
So you're trying to ground morality in a cosmic dictator, but you're brushing past the hardest part of your own argument. Let's break down the Euthyphro dilemma.
Plato.
Yes, because this ancient philosophical trap fundamentally dismantles the idea that God is the necessary grounding for objective morality.
I wouldn't say it dismantles it, but it certainly asks a vital question.
It forces a choice. So Plato asked, is something morally good because God commands it? Or does God command it because it is independently morally good?
Right.
Let's take the first option. If something is good simply because God commands it, then morality is completely arbitrary. God could command cruelty, deception, or the torture of children tomorrow, and by your definition, it would instantly become good.
Which no serious theologian actually believes.
Exactly, which forces you to the second option. If God commands something because it is already morally good, then that standard of goodness exists entirely independently of God's will.
I see the trap.
Right. God is just a middleman passing along a standard he didn't create. Therefore, God is entirely unnecessary for objective morality. The dilemma reveals that divine commands are either dangerously arbitrary or completely redundant.
So what's your alternative?
We don't need a transcendent lawgiver. We prefer human flourishing because we are humans. Actions that promote flourishing and reduce suffering become our moral baseline. It's practical, observable reality.
It's an incredibly clever dilemma, I'll give you that. And I have to admit, when I first studied it years ago, it seemed like a bulletproof trap. But the Euthyphro dilemma actually presents a false dichotomy.
How is it a false dichotomy? It covers both logical options.
You're saying the standard is either arbitrary to God's whims or it sits above God. But the classical theistic response is a third option. God's very nature is the standard of goodness. He commands what is good because he is essentially unchangeably good.
Wait, so he can't command cruelty?
He cannot command cruelty because it would violate his own nature.
But that just pushes the problem back a step. You're just redefining the word good to mean God's nature.
No, I'm saying the stopping point for all reality, including moral reality, must be a necessary being. Without that transcendent standard, your idea of human flourishing is just a subjective preference of one particular species on one tiny planet.
It's subjective to our species, yes.
But why ought we prefer human flourishing over the flourishing of a virus that wants to consume us? Evolutionary biology can beautifully describe what happens in nature, but it can never dictate what ought to happen.
I look at the devastation a virus causes, and the answer to why we prefer human flourishing is pretty self-evident to any rational, empathetic primate.
Self-evident emotionally? Sure.
But let's broaden the scope even further. Let's move from human morality to the origin and complexity of the universe itself, because this is where the debate over explanatory power really peaks.
I welcome that, because if we look at the origin of the cosmos, theism provides the absolute most robust explanatory power available. Take the cosmological argument.
Okay.
We know the universe had a beginning, the Big Bang. Things in the physical world are contingent. They don't cause themselves. Whatever begins to exist must have a cause. Since an infinite regress of physical causes is logically impossible, there must be a necessary, uncaused, non-physical being that initiated the cosmos.
Wait, you're looking at the ultimate complexity of the universe, the fine-tuning of physics, the birth of stars, and your solution is to introduce something even more complex to explain it?
It's not just about complexity. It's about what Richard Swinburne calls the simplicity and unity of the hypothesis. Consider the anthropic coincidences. If the gravitational constant were altered by a fraction of a percent, the universe would have either collapsed back in on itself or expanded too rapidly for stars to form.
The fine-tuning argument.
Right. Consider the astonishing applicability of complex mathematics to the physical world. Math is an abstract concept, a property of mind, yet it perfectly predicts the behavior of the physical universe. Under naturalism, this incredible alignment is just a massive, irrational coincidence. Under theism, it makes perfect logical sense. A supreme mind created the physical world based on mathematical structures.
I have a major problem with Swinburne's idea of simplicity, though. And this is where Richard Dawkins' ultimate Boeing 747 argument really strikes a fatal blow to your premise.
I know this argument well.
For the sake of the listeners, let's unpack it. Dawkins points out that creationists often use the analogy of a hurricane blowing through a junkyard and accidentally assembling a Boeing 747.
Right, pointing out the improbability of chance.
Exactly. They say the universe is too complex to be an accident, so it must be designed. But to design the universe as complex as ours, capable of generating quantum mechanics, chemistry, and conscious life, that designer would have to be infinitely more complex than the universe itself.
I see the rhetorical appeal, but
Just a second. You haven't solved the problem of ultimate complexity. You've merely deflected it. Who designed the designer? Who built the ultimate 747? It is far more parsimonious, mathematically and logically, to accept the natural laws as brutal facts than to invent an infinitely complex deity to explain them.
I will completely admit, the first time I read Dawkins' ultimate 747 argument, it stumped me. It sounds incredibly rhetorically powerful. But then I realized Dawkins is making a massive category error. He is assuming God is made of parts.
How is that a category error? Complexity implies moving parts, information, structure.
Physical complexity does, yes. A Boeing 747 is complex because it is composed of millions of physical parts that require assembly. But a mind, in philosophical terms, is fundamentally simple.
Simple?
Yes, it is not made of physical parts. An uncaused, infinite, unified mind doesn't have a biological structure that needs evolving or a mechanical engine that needs assembling. Therefore, positing an infinite mind as the source of the universe does not violate Occam's razor. It satisfies it perfectly. We are tracing the physical complexity back to a non-physical simplicity.
That sounds like a massive semantic escape hatch. You're essentially saying, my designer is exempt from the rules of complexity because I simply define him as simple.
It's not semantic. It's philosophical categorization.
But let's look at the actual reality of this supposedly elegant, flawlessly designed universe. This designer hypothesis crashes headfirst into the problem of evil.
And this is the hardest question of all.
It is. Because if your designer is perfectly good and all-powerful, how do you reconcile that with a natural world filled with entirely undeserved suffering? I'm not just talking about humans making bad moral choices.
You mean natural evil?
Yes. I'm talking about bone cancer in children. I'm talking about tsunamis that wipe out hundreds of thousands of people. If the universe is designed, it is designed with a profound amount of baked-in cruelty. Why demand a God who constantly intervenes with miracles when David Hume already showed us that human testimony of supernatural intervention is far less reliable than the brutal consistency of natural law?
You're absolutely right that the problem of evil is the most profound emotional and philosophical challenge to theism. I will never pretend otherwise. But let's look at the mechanism of that reality. Moral evil, the terrible things humans do to one another, requires free will.
Which covers the human aspect, yes.
Right. A world with free creatures capable of genuine love, moral choice, and true rationality is inherently more valuable than a world of biological automatons, even if those free creatures introduce deep suffering through their choices.
But what about the natural disasters, the bone cancer? That's not human free will.
Nope, it isn't. Natural evils exist in a universe operating under consistent natural laws, and as you just pointed out via Hume, those consistent natural laws are strictly necessary for any rational existence, scientific inquiry, or cause-and-effect environment.
Okay, but God could stop the tsunami.
If God constantly intervened to stop every falling rock from hitting a person, the physical world would be utterly chaotic and unpredictable. We cannot demand a universe governed by consistent physical laws to allow for scientific predictability, and then be outraged when gravity causes a tsunami.
But don't you see the contradiction there? You are demanding consistent physical laws to explain the rational order of the universe, while simultaneously demanding that a transcendent mind can effortlessly violate those laws via miracles whenever it suits a theological narrative. You simply can't have it both ways.
I don't believe a miracle is a violence of natural law. I believe it's the injection of a new cause by the author of the system.
Well, to a scientist, that's a distinction without a difference. The naturalistic framework is mathematically and empirically consistent from the ground up without needing that author.
But it lacks ultimate grounding.
We don't need a supernatural hypothesis to explain the Big Bang. We have inflationary cosmology and quantum fluctuation. We don't need a divine lawgiver to explain why we don't murder each other. We have evolutionary game theory and sociology.
We don't need a ghost in the machine to explain spiritual euphoria. We have the ventromedial prefrontal cortex, dopamine, and the VMAT2 dial.
Which all beautifully describe the mechanics, yes.
Occam's razor cuts away the divine, leaving us with a universe that is self-contained, governed entirely by physics, and apprehended by a highly evolved primate brain just trying to make sense of the dark. We have everything we need right here in the physical world.
It is probably time for us to summarize our positions in light of this incredibly rigorous discussion.
Agreed.
I hear your points about the physical mechanisms, but my perspective remains that while neurocognitive science beautifully maps the how of belief, the dopamine, the prefrontal cortex modulation, it does not, and logically cannot, invalidate the object of that belief.
I see.
The seamless coexistence of our rational, analytic capacities with our deep spiritual experiences demonstrates that we are designed to apprehend the divine. When you combine this internal biological harmony with the external realities, the logical necessity of a first cause, the elegant fine-tuning of the physical universe, and the universal haunting of objective moral duties, the arrows point compellingly away from blind chance and toward a purposeful creator. We are not cosmic accidents generated by evolutionary forces. We are intentional beings utilizing our neurocognitive architecture to look back at our origin.
And I will summarize by reiterating that when you look through that telescope, you really are just looking at the dust on your own lens. The combination of naturalism, evolutionary psychology, and neurobiology provides a complete, remarkably elegant explanation for the human tendency to believe in gods.
Which is a very cohesive worldview, I admit.
Right. We don't need to look beyond the physical structures of the human brain and the power of social construction to understand the origin of religion. The concept of God is a fascinating, beautifully complex byproduct of our neurocognitive architecture and our evolutionary need for survival, meaning, and group cohesion. It is an artifact of human evolution. We are alone in the universe, but we have each other. And we have the scientific method to uncover the actual verifiable truths of our existence.
I think we can both agree on the sheer complexity of disentangling our deeply ingrained biological predispositions from the pursuit of objective reality. The intersection of brain mechanics and metaphysical truth is perhaps the most profound frontier of human inquiry.
I agree completely. And there is a vast wealth of material available to further explore this, from extensive philosophical treatises mapping out the Euthyphro dilemma and Dawkins 747, to long-term functional neuroimaging studies detailing the exact behavior of our prefrontal cortex during spiritual states. We highly suggest that our listeners explore these materials and draw their own conclusions.
So at the end of the day, are we simply analyzing a speck of evolutionary dust on the lens of our biology, or are we truly observing a distant radiant star? That is the question that remains with you.